If Russian civilian morale is kind of affected by the fact that they see their country, they see Putin as not winning this war, his war, then support for Putin might be undermined. As you said, there's elections next year in Russia, and obviously Putin will win them. Obviously, the election will be fixed, but it's a bellwether. The elections, how much support is there for Putin? And so the whole reporting in the Russian media of the war in Ukraine has to be kind of shown in a certain positive light. But that's why it makes it interesting why the loss of the Novichokazk, or the severe damage to it, has been reported in Russian media. That might be telling us something about perhaps the nature going forward of Russian media reporting of the war itself.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Dr. Rod Thornton, a senior lecturer in defence studies at King's College London. Rod has previously served for 9 years in the British Army and now specialises in the study of the Russian military, particularly its emphasis on sub-threshold warfare activities such as cyber and psychological operations. Rod, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Hello, hi.
I think we probably better begin with the big news of recent days. Russia has confirmed one of its warships has been damaged in a Ukrainian attack on a Black Sea port. Can you just talk us through what we know about what's happened?
Well, I think what's happened here is that the Russian army has been transporting from Russia itself across the Black Sea to the Crimean Peninsula a lot of Shahed drones from Iran. And I think obviously intelligence in the West, NATO, has picked up on the transport of these cross Black Sea transport vessels using landing vessels. I used to call them landing ship tanks, very large landing vessels, which seem to be transporting these Shahed drones. Now, once this particular landing vessel, the Novichokazk, docked in Feodosia on the Crimean Peninsula, it's been taken out, shall we say, by a Storm Shadow missile fired by Ukrainian aircraft. And this landing vessel, the Novichokazk, seems to have been totally destroyed as far as I can see.
And what do you think the significance is of the fact it was a Storm Shadow?
Well, obviously these have been supplied by both the French and the British to the Ukrainians. They are the only long-range cruise missiles supplied to Ukraine. The US hasn't supplied any for fear of, shall we say, prodding Putin, prodding Russia. So these Storm Shadow missiles, they're very expensive. They're very small in number, and so they're going to be husbanded by the Ukrainian forces. But within large targets like this, with kind of prize targets like this particular vessel, then they will be used for kind of almost operational level activities. But this is almost strategic level activities in terms of destroying perhaps hundreds of these drones, which regularly attack Ukraine.
The Novichokazk was in port at the time of the attack. Do we know if there's been any damage to the port itself?
We can imagine there's some damage to the port facilities, but basically it seems to be out on a kind of quayside, and so there won't be that major damage in the port itself, no.
I mean, there are two ways of looking at this in terms of the victory it represents for Ukraine, the symbolic, and we'll come on to that, but also the strategic. Strategically, how significant is it?
It's not that strategically significant. The Russians will find a way around this. Once these things happen, the Russians will learn lessons. Throughout the war, the Russian military has learned its lessons. So there will be a change in kind of approach in terms of delivering these Shahed drones to the peninsula, where they can be used against Ukrainian targets.
What do you think they will do instead then? If they are going to transfer these drones in a different way, how will they do it?
Well, they go across the Kerch Bridge. The bridge has been attacked fairly regularly by the Ukrainian forces. There's obviously a target, but it's still open. And I think that these particular drones can be transported across that bridge, as well as perhaps by smaller vessels. And the Storm Shadows can't be used against smaller vessels because they'd just be a waste of assets. So I think the Russian military will kind of find ways around this, shall we say? Yeah.
Do you think we can? Yeah. So I was going to say, do you think well, we can expect to see Ukraine upping its attacks on the Kerch Bridge? Because if that is now the route that Russia is having to take, do you think we can expect them to target it even more?
Well, they could, but again, it's this learning lessons idea. The Russian military will have learned its lessons from previous attacks on the Kerch Bridge. So where do the Russians need to have their defences to make sure that things like drones or missile attacks occur in the future? There will be increased what they call GBAD, ground-based air defence assets, Russian GBAD assets based around the bridge to kind of try and take out any drones, any missiles that are being fired by the Ukrainians at the bridge. So everything the Ukrainians do, there'll be a kind of reaction by the Russians to, in essence, kind of try and deal with what the Ukrainians are doing.
How big a failure of Russian air defences is this?
It's a failure to a large degree, but we have to understand that ground-based air defence works best in a coordinated way. And the Russians have shown throughout the Russian military, throughout this conflict, has shown a lack of coordination. So in essence, the anti-aircraft assets that the Russians have are really very effective. But what they've not been used, they haven't been used correctly, shall we say. So there's been failings. But again, these failings will be corrected and are being corrected as the Russian military goes forward and gains experience of what this war is all about.
And then symbolically, Rod, what do you think this means for the war, particularly where we are now? And given some of the narrative of recent weeks and months, with Putin sounding increasingly bullish, he's going into an election year, all kinds of speculation about continued Western support for Ukraine. I mean, this is sort of a perfect Christmas present in a way for Zelensky.
Yes, for Ukrainian Christmas, yeah, which is now being transferred to the 25th of December. Yes, so it will be a big present for the Ukrainian people, because what the Ukrainian people are suffering mostly from is these attacks by the Russians using drones, mostly in this case cheap Iranian drones, but also the occasional major missile attack by Russian forces, which is slowly but surely perhaps undermining Ukrainian civilian morale. And this is one of the major problems going forward. The longer this war drags on and the more attacks there are by Russian forces, we can see from the polling that the support for Zelensky is going down, and support for keeping the war going against Russia is also falling. So what the Russians are trying to do with their missile attacks and their drone attacks is to gradually undermine the morale of the civilian Ukrainian population so that Zelensky is undermined. So it's important for the Ukrainian military to try and target the supply of these drones, missiles, whatever, and to try and reduce the number of attacks by the Russian military on Ukrainian targets.
What do we know about the Russian response so far? Because they have already carried out aerial bombardment on several targets in Ukraine, including using Shahed drones. And of course, there were Shahed drones that were targeted in this attack.
Yeah, it's an action-reaction philosophy that Russia has to respond. If the Ukrainians do something dramatic, the Russian media have reported the loss, or shall we say, the severe damage to the Novichokazk. So we can understand why the Russians then would have to take on actions of their own to basically kind of teach Ukraine a lesson. Please don't do this again, because you are going to get more missile attacks and more drone attacks if you do this once more.
On the point about media reporting of these attacks in Russia, do we know how aware the average Russian person is of the way in which the Black Sea Fleet has been essentially rendered useless, some would say? I mean, the sinking of the Moskva last year was a hugely symbolic moment. Is that something a lot of Russians are aware of?
Well, no. I mean, obviously the media will be very constrained. Russian media will be very constrained in its reporting of things going wrong, shall we say, in the Ukraine war. And it's vitally important, it's the idea of civilian morale again. If Russian civilian morale is kind of affected by the fact that they see their country, they see Putin as not winning this war, his war, then support for Putin might be undermined. As you said, there's elections next year in Russia, and obviously Putin will win them. Obviously, the election will be fixed, but it's a bellwether. The elections, how much support is there for Putin? And so the whole reporting in the Russian media of the war in Ukraine has to be kind of shown in a certain positive light. But that's why it makes it interesting why the loss of the Novichokazk, or the severe damage to it, has been reported in Russian media. That might be telling us something about perhaps the nature going forward of Russian media reporting of the war itself.
I suppose even more significantly, possibly, is the reaction of people around Putin and Russian military bloggers, for example, who often criticise Putin from the ultra-nationalist perspective. Yeah. And they must be very alarmed by what has happened to the Black Sea Fleet over the last couple of years.
Yes, I mean, it's obvious that this fleet has been rendered useless, basically. Larger vessels like the Moskva have been sunk. Other Rapucha-class landing craft like the Novocherkassk have also been sunk before. So we have to look upon the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Black Sea as not being a major strategic element. There were some very old ships in the Black Sea Fleet, the very vulnerable ships like the Moskva. And so we can't look upon the Black Sea Fleet. Yes, there are some very modern corvettes in the Black Sea Fleet, and they have been showed back to the major Russian military port of, ironically, Novocherkassk, in Russia itself, across the Black Sea. So, yes, it's strategically it's damning, because with the Black Sea Fleet being neutralized, that means that Ukrainian ships can freely move through the Black Sea, especially Ukrainian merchant vessels. So the economy of Ukraine is being, I mean, it's bolstered by the fact that its merchant vessels can move up and down the Black Sea to Ukrainian ports without fear of being intercepted by Russian naval vessels, which have to be are being in essence blockaded in harbours.
Just put, if you can, Rod, Ukraine's success in the Black Sea into perspective. I mean, how remarkable has it been? If we were having this conversation at the start of 2022 when the full-scale invasion began, and I told you that by the end of 2023, Russia's Black Sea Fleet would essentially be useless, how would you have responded at the time?
It wouldn't have been that much of a surprise, because the Black Sea Fleet, for air defence protection, relied on the Moskva. The Moskva was an air defence cruiser. So its role was to protect the rest of the Black Sea Fleet from air attack with its radar and its anti-aircraft missiles. And once the Moskva has been lost, there are no other vessels which can, in essence, protect Russian naval vessels from air attack. Because what can't happen is the Russians can't reinforce the Black Sea Fleet, because the Bosphorus Strait has been closed by Turkey under the Montreux Convention of 1936. There is no movement of Russian naval vessels from, say, the Baltic Fleet or the Pacific Fleet into the Black Sea, because it's not allowed. The Turks will not allow it. Therefore, once this major Russian vessel, the Moskva, has been lost, it can't be replaced. So in essence, if that vessel was lost, it's a very, very old ship, and it was a very old ship. So I would have expected it not to last very long in a war like this, a modern war, shall we say, as we have now.
Given that, do you think we can expect to see Ukraine continuing to target the Black Sea Fleet, or have we reached the point now where they have almost extracted the most military capital as they can from it?
Yes, I think, as I said before, the Russian Navy, the Russian military will have learned lessons about how it deploys its fleet, how it deploys its vessels, the remaining vessels of the Black Sea Fleet. So again, it's a reducing of the target set available to the Ukrainian military as the Russian Navy learns lessons. But it does restrict, because of the lack of movement, or the ability to move naval vessels around the eastern Black Sea, which will severely restrict the capabilities of the Russian military to, in essence, reinforce Crimea. Remember, Crimea, in essence, can only be kind of reinforced by some roads across southern Ukraine, which can be interdicted by Ukrainian artillery and by missiles and Ukrainian drones themselves, and across the Kerch Bridge. So is having a major effect, but the target set for Ukrainian military for its missiles will be reduced in future.
Let's move on, Rod, to the situation in the east of Ukraine, with Russia claiming to have captured Marinka, which seems like quite a significant moment. General Zaluzhny essentially saying that, yes, their forces have withdrawn from Marinka now. Just sum up the strategic significance of it. Obviously, its proximity to Donetsk makes it quite strategically significant, but is it as important as, for example, were Avdiivka to fall?
It's more, shall we say, psychological, the loss of these. They're really quite small villages, small towns, shall we say. And they're just ruins anyway by now. So it's just the kind of psychological effect of losing, for the Ukrainians, losing territory to the Russian forces. Yes, it will be operationally significant, shall we say, because Russian artillery will be moved further back from Donetsk itself by this activity, by moving out of Marinka. And this has only been the Russian goal with pushing back the Ukrainian forces in this particular sector, is to try and push back Ukrainian artillery, so it's not shelling the major city of Donetsk, which is obviously has been Russian held since 2014. And so all these minor pushes backward are more psychological than they are strategic. but they do have operational significance, either the level below strategic.
What lessons do you think the Russians will learn as they continue to try and capture Avdiivka, given their success now in Mariupol?
They will push on Avdiivka, but again, it's been fought over for so long, and it isn't that significant strategically. And again, it's psychological. And in many ways, it might be better for the Ukrainians to pull back to better defensive positions and really kind of allow these small towns, which really don't have significance beyond the psychological, just let it go and fall back to better defensive positions.
But I mean, it feels, Rod, like we're in a phase of the war now where the symbolism is strategically important, because if you're Zelensky and you can point to success in the Black Sea or holding on to Avdiivka or what have you, or even crossing the Dnieper River and establishing a bridgehead, you can go back to Congress, you can go back to the EU and say, look, we are having success, supply us more, and we can continue to make progress. And on the flip side, if you're Putin going into an election year when you're trying to fend off a threat from your ultranationalist right, and of course he's faced down the mutiny from Prigozhin, you need some symbolic successes as well now.
You do, yes. Symbolism. But symbolism costs lives. It costs the lives of soldiers. If you take from the Ukrainian point of view, you're sending these troops into a meat grinder. You're continually sending your young men into a meat grinder, which maybe has no major significance beyond the symbolic. But at some point, you have to husband your human resources. You can't just keep sending troops into, as I said, a meat grinder. And also, eventually, the forces themselves will say, please, no more. I'm not going to go back to that city and fight for it. What's the point? So when you have to think about the military. I'm speaking as an ex-soldier. You have to think about the troops themselves. Can you keep shedding blood for basically just bits of territory?
Do you think that the conversation around troop numbers for Ukraine has maybe gone underreported? So many people have focused on the Russian casualty rate, which of course has been, as far as we're aware, far higher. But then, of course, they're on the offensive, or have been in recent months. We know that Zelensky wants to mobilise up to 500,000 more troops, and that sounds necessary. But do you think the Ukrainian casualty rate has perhaps gone underreported?
I think it has, always for reasons of, again, symbolism. The Ukrainian forces the Ukrainian government wants to give the impression to its own people, especially, that this war is winnable and we can win it without too much bloodshed. And that's important from Zelensky's point of view, to try and mask, shall we say, the friendly casualties that Ukrainian forces are taking. And it will put pressure on Zelensky going forward. He has reduced the age of mobilization from 27 down to 25. But that also means that young men in Ukraine under 25 are not being mobilized. They're not being called into the military, which kind of gives a sense of, to the people, the older people, why are we older people doing the fighting and you younger people under 25 are not doing the fighting? And that might create a schism. And I think it is creating a schism within Ukrainian society about who is doing the fighting. In large part, the young middle class is evading fighting in the war. And but that's important to Zelensky, because the younger middle class kind of other class that supports him. So he can't dig too deep into that well of human resources. He has to keep this war a winnable war, but not involving the whole of society, having just men over 27 doing the fighting so that younger men are not affected by this war.
Is 500,000 extra troops for Ukraine going to be enough, Rod?
It depends what they want to do. If in 2024 going forward they adopt defensive positions, which I think the US military wants them to do, the US government wants the Ukrainians not to waste too much, waste is the wrong word, to use too much materiel in offensives. Because offensives are really quite expensive in terms of the number of shells you have to use, the number of missiles you fire, the amount of fuel. A lot of things in a military organization you need far more of them on the offense than you do on the defense. And basically, Ukraine has run out of artillery shells, and Europe has run out of artillery shells to supply the Ukrainians with. And the Americans are reluctant at the moment to supply too much material to the Ukrainian military. So from the from the American point of view, they will be putting pressure on the Ukrainians next year to adopt more defensive positions, which means just less materiel, both physical and human, being expended in the war going forward. That will be for the Ukrainians a bitter pill to swallow because they want to regain their territory. But how do they get the support of the West, the Americans and the Europeans, if they try and conduct another offensive next year, which might again end in failure?
I mean, that's interesting. There's obviously been a lot of analysis of the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer and early autumn, and it's sort of, I don't want to say failures, but maybe it didn't live up to expectations. There is a lot of conversation currently around what a potential counteroffensive from Ukraine in the spring or early summer might look like. But is there any guarantee there will be a Ukrainian counteroffensive? Might it just be a year of holding defensive position?
I think it will be. I think it's too much to ask the West to maintain the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian economy when the Ukrainian forces are on the offensive. It'd be far easier for everybody in the West for the Ukrainians to adopt a more defensive position. But for Zelensky to do that and to say to his people, sorry, but we can't take Crimea back. We can't take back the Eastern Donbass. And that's going to push Zelensky's popularity down. So you have a kind of pressure there on Zelensky. What does he do? Does he kind of do what the West tells him to do in terms of adopting defensive positions? Or does he do what will gain him domestic popularity, i.e. maintain the offensive against the Russians?
Do you think even if Congress approves the increased military support for Ukraine and the EU continues to provide support in the UK and what have you, and the F-16s are deployed on the front line, even then, you think it is unrealistic for Ukraine to make significant progress this year?
Yeah. When you have a military organisation like the Ukrainian military, which wasn't that big before the war, which wasn't well supplied, which wasn't well trained, which didn't really have the wherewithal to conduct a war. When you take a military like that and try and create an offensive force that can conduct combined arms maneuver in a way that, say, NATO militaries would do, it's a big ask. It takes a long time. There isn't a magic bullet that we supply high-tech weapon systems like the F-16 to the Ukrainians and everything's going to work out wonderfully. It takes a lot of integration. A modern military organisation is a very holistic enterprise. It takes a lot of things to work well. Training, morale, yes, the machines of war, the fighter aircraft and the tanks and the armour personnel carriers. But you have to marry all that stuff together. And that takes a lot of training, a lot of organisation. And it can't be done within just a few months. Things like the F-16s you talk about. Well, it takes the F-16 pilots to be trained over quite a few months and to be trained to a degree where they work in a coordinated fashion with the ground forces. That again takes another few months to kind of make work in the way that it should. It's a long process is what I'm saying. You can't just magic up a Ukrainian military that's going to take on the Russian military in just a few months. It's going to take at least a year.
But you don't think, Rod, that there has been a pattern in the war so far that a certain narrative emerges. When Russia launched the full-scale invasion, there was an expectation that they would take Kyiv potentially within a matter of weeks. It didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Then there was a lot of optimism earlier this year that Ukraine might end up in Crimea by the end of the year. That clearly has not happened. Do you think that some of the negativity around Ukraine's campaign at the moment might actually be misplaced and maybe their position is actually fundamentally stronger than people are giving it credit for?
There is an argument to say that. But we have to look to the future. The Russian military, as I've said before, have been learning lessons. They are getting better. They made a lot of mistakes at the start of the war, and they do have their problems, notably in terms of recruitment. How do they get the manpower? How do they replace the Russian military? How do they replace the losses that they've had so far? Something like 350,000, shall we say. That is a huge amount of men to lose. How are they going to be replaced? So, yes, there's a problem for the Russian military body. So if the argument is if the Ukrainian military keeps pushing, and the casualty rate of the Russian military starts to rise and rise and rise, you will get some internal, shall we say, revolt, perhaps too big a word, in Russia itself, where the reaction to the losses will cause some sort of pressure on Putin to stop the war. However, Putin's been very careful. He's not really involved the young middle class in Petersburg and Moscow in this war. This war is being fought by mostly mercenary groups, I think the Chechens, Syrians, Libyans, whoever they can recruit to fight in their military, and guys from eastern Siberia, whose losses don't really register with the people in Moscow and Petersburg. When the young men of Moscow and Petersburg start dying in this war, then there might be some reaction. But Putin's been very clever. The vast majority of the Russian casualties have been from the Far East, from southern Russia, from the Caucasian republics, and from private military companies, mercenaries. But there might come a point where Putin has to call on, or has to spread the net wider of who he can use in this war. And that then might put pressure on him, because then you might get the young men of Petersburg and Moscow dying in this war, and that will put pressure on him domestically.
And do we have any idea, Rod, when that point might come? I mean, if you take the current casualty rates, we don't know exactly, but let's say tens of thousands of Russian men appear to be dying every month on the front line in Ukraine. How long can they sustain that before Putin has to look at conscription again?
Well, there is conscription now in Russia.
Conscription of more of the younger Muscovites and people from St. Petersburg that you articulate.
That will come. That is the tipping point. What Putin has not sent to Russia is young conscripts. It's only professional forces, and as I said, all of the groups I've mentioned, who do the fighting in Ukraine. So Putin has said to the Russian people, I am not sending your young men, the conscripts, to fight in this war. In future, he might have to send the conscripts to war, and then that might change the balance in terms of domestic support for Putin. But when that tipping point comes, when Putin is called upon to send the conscripts, the Russian conscripts, go and fight in Ukraine, that might prove the tipping point. But what will happen first? Will Ukrainian morale crack first, or Russian, in that case, morale crack first? It's going to be a long war. And this is one of the issues you talked about earlier about, is the Ukrainian military being successful? Yes, they are trying to be symbolically successful in various places. But are they being really successful is another question. It's been, I think, in large measure for the Ukrainian military. Yes, we've crossed the river Dnipro around Kherson. We've made pushes in various villages in eastern Donbass. And so it's symbolism. There aren't many major gains being made by the Ukrainian military. And unless and until there are, then what is support in Ukraine itself, amongst the Ukrainian population, going to be like? As I mentioned before, with the polling is showing that Zelensky is becoming less popular as the war drags on, and support for the war itself amongst the Ukrainian population is now falling. Not below 50%, not below 60%, but it's falling. So that has to be factored in as we go forward into next year, and how the war is going to be conducted, how the war is going to be shaped next year, and who is going to shape it. Are the Russians going to shape it? Will they conduct offensives next year, or will the Ukrainians conduct offensives next year? But I think the push from the West, from the Americans, and from the Europeans is, okay, we'd like to support you, but we have to support your economy most of all, and that costs billions of pounds basically per week to support the Ukrainian economy from the West. And so the US would like to see, I think, a negotiated settlement, although they won't say it, a negotiated settlement that will kind of basically mean that the West doesn't have to keep supplying Ukraine with military hardware and economic support, basically ad infinitum.
And just finally, Rod, looking ahead to the next couple of months, what would constitute a successful rest of the winter campaign for Ukraine?
Basically holding the line, basically maintaining some sort of military presence across the Dnipro River around Kherson, as I mentioned, and also not losing, shall we say, further villages along the front line like Mariinka, holding on to Avdiivka. These kind of symbolic, that are made into kind of, okay, they are, I said, they're not that strategically important, but they're so symbolically important that Ukraine has to hang on to these over the winter, and to see what the issue is, or the situation is next year. But what the situation is early next year, when you might launch an offensive in the spring months, is very hard to tell.
Dr. Rod Thornton, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel, listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.